To this day, I refuse to drive that road after midnight. It isn't a matter of superstition or a stubborn refusal to face my fears. It is a calculated decision based on the simple reality that some places retain things that should no longer exist. When you spend years working the late shift in logistics, driving becomes less of a task and more of a meditative state. You learn to read the asphalt like a book, predicting the curves by the lean of the chassis, judging the dampness of the air by the way your headlights slice through the dark. But nothing in my 10 years of driving commercial vans and old sedans through the interior of Galicia ever prepared me for the stretch of road between Lugo and the coast. It is a landscape defined by its isolation, a place where the hills seem to swallow the sky, and the ancient eucalyptus forests press so close to the shoulder that their branches form a chaotic canopy overhead, blotting out whatever faint light the moon might offer. That night was a Tuesday in mid-October. I had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift at a distribution hub near Osio, supervising the unloading of 3 massive freight trucks that had arrived late due to a strike at the French border. By the time I finally punched my time card and climbed into my old 4-door sedan, it was already past 2 in the morning. My muscles ached, my eyes felt like they were full of sand, and the only thing keeping me awake was a bitter, lukewarm cup of gas station coffee that tasted mostly of plastic. The weather was typical for that time of year in northern Spain, a thick, clinging mist that the locals call calorina. It isn't exactly rain, but rather a suspended moisture that hangs in the air, coating everything in a slick, greasy film and turning the darkness into something opaque and heavy. As I left the main highway and turned onto the secondary road that would take me home, my GPS screen flickered twice, the blue arrow spinning aimlessly before freezing on a completely blank grid. I didn't think much of it. Cellular coverage in those deep river valleys has always been notoriously unreliable, a casualty of the jagged topography and the lack of modern infrastructure. I knew the route by heart anyway, or at least, I had traveled it enough times to feel a false sense of security. I rolled the window down a fraction of an inch to let the damp, chilly air hit my face, hoping the shock of the cold would counteract the hypnotic rhythm of the windshield wipers. The only sound was the low, mechanical drone of my tires on the old, coarse asphalt and the occasional crackle of static from the radio, which had lost all signal about 10 kilometers back. I was negotiating a long, descending series of blind switchbacks when the atmosphere inside the car changed. It's hard to describe accurately, but it felt as though the air pressure had dropped suddenly, the way it does right before a massive lightning strike. I tapped my brakes, dropping my speed to around 50 kilometers per hour as I approached a particularly sharp, unlit curve where the road cut through a solid wall of granite. That was when my high beams caught a brief, impossible flash of white against the dark, wet trunks of the trees. My foot moved to the brake pedal instinctively, the pads gripping the discs with a low, metallic groan. As the car rounded the apex of the bend, the lights illuminated a figure standing directly on the narrow gravel shoulder, barely 2 feet from the white line. It was a young woman. She was standing completely upright, her back to the road, staring directly into the impenetrable blackness of the woods. She wore a simple, light-colored cotton dress that looked entirely wrong for a chilly autumn night. It had no sleeves, no jacket, and yet she wasn't shivering. My immediate reaction wasn't fear. It was the logical concern of someone who lives in a rural area. Out here, a person on the side of the road at 3 in the morning usually means a catastrophic vehicular breakdown, a medical emergency, or someone who has wandered away from one of the isolated farmsteads in a state of disorientation. I brought the sedan to a complete stop a few meters past her, the rear tires skidding slightly on the wet leaves that littered the asphalt. The red glow of my braking lights cast long, bleeding shadows across the wet pavement and the low stone wall that separated the road from a steep drop into the ravine. I shifted into neutral, pulled the handbrake, and leaned across the passenger seat to roll down the window. The damp, cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying the pungent, medicinal scent of bruised eucalyptus and wet earth. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and strangely muted against the vast silence of the hills. "Are you okay? Do you need some help?" She didn't react immediately. For 3 or 4 seconds, she remained perfectly static, a pale silhouette against the dark forest. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed entirely mechanical, she turned around. Her face was pale, not the gray pallor of a corpse, but the waxen, bloodless look of someone who had been exposed to the elements for hours. Her dark, wet hair hung in straight, heavy strands around her shoulders, framing eyes that looked incredibly tired. She didn't look angry, nor did she look relieved to see a car. Her expression was completely neutral, devoid of any human emotion. She walked toward the passenger side with a steady, measured stride, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel, and stopped right next to the door. I reached over to unlock the doors manually. "Get in before you catch pneumonia," I said, trying to sound welcoming. "It's freezing out here." She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat with an eerie fluidness. As she closed the door, a wave of intense, dry, cold address seemed to settle into the car. It wasn't the natural chill of the night air. It felt like the draft that escapes when you open an old industrial freezer. It made the hairs on my arms stand up, and I instinctively turned the dial on the heater to its maximum setting. She didn't reach for the seat belt. She just sat perfectly rigid, her hands resting flat on her lap, her eyes fixed directly on the dark road ahead. "Where are you heading?" I asked, shifting the car back into first gear and pulling away from the shoulder. "Is there a town or a specific junction you need to get to?" She didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head to acknowledge that I had spoken. She just kept staring straight through the windshield. "Are you from around here?" I pressed, trying to maintain a casual, reassuring tone despite the sudden wall of silence. "Did your car break down farther up the road?" Nothing, not a word, not a nod, not a single movement. "Are you lost then?" I tried again, my voice growing a bit tighter. "There aren't many houses out this way. If you were at a party or something, your friends shouldn't have left you out here alone. It's incredibly dangerous." The silence inside the car became dense, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable, broken only by the loud, artificial blasting of the heater vents. I kept glancing at her from the corner of my eye. Her profile was completely immobile. Her chest didn't seem to rise or fall with breath, and despite the intense heat now pumping into the cabin, her breath didn't condense in the air. The passenger side window, however, was beginning to fog up rapidly from the bottom edge, a thick layer of moisture obscuring the dark trees outside. "I'm Miguel, by the way," I offered, desperate to break the psychological weight of her absolute refusal to speak. "I work down at the logistics park. I take this road every night, so don't worry, I'll keep you safe until we find a place with phone service." She didn't acknowledge my name. She didn't even blink. Her hands remained perfectly still on her knees, her skin looking almost blue under the dim, orange glow of the dashboard lights. "You really shouldn't be out walking in a dress like that," I continued, my own voice beginning to sound forced, sounding louder in my own ears as I tried to fill the void she left. "The weather here changes in an instant, and the drivers, people fly down these hills without looking. We get a lot of wild boars crossing the road too. A hit and run out here means you could lie in the ditch for days before anyone finds you." Still, she offered no reply. Her complete lack of reaction was starting to make my stomach twist into a tight knot of pure anxiety. It wasn't normal. Even a person in deep shock would flinch, or turn their head, or show some microscopic sign of life. But she sat there like a mannequin clothed in cotton. I turned my attention fully back to the road, trying to convince myself she was just too traumatized to talk. We were approaching a long, descending series of turns that led down to a narrow valley. The fog was growing thicker now, swirling in front of my high beams like pale, phantom smoke. I tapped my brakes, the car slowing down as we neared a notoriously sharp, blind bend hanging over the ravine. "Look," I said, my voice losing its polite veneer, becoming strained. "We are getting close to the old dangerous stretch. If you're having some kind of trouble or if someone hurt you, you don't have to talk right now. Just hang on." She remained completely mute, but as the car began to lean into the sharpest angle of the bend, her entire posture shifted. She didn't turn to face me, but she slowly raised a thin, pale index finger, pointing straight through the windshield at the guardrail ahead. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted instantly, freezing the breath inside my throat. "Be careful with that curve," she whispered. Her voice didn't sound like it came from a living person. It was a hollow, echoing vibration that seemed to emanate directly from the glass of the windows, rattling the dashboard. "That is the curve where I died." Before my brain could even process the horror of her words, a massive shape materialized in the middle of the lane, a collapsed boulder from the hillside, completely blocking the path. "Oh my God," I gasped, slamming my foot onto the brake pedal with everything I had. The tires locked up instantly. The sedan skidded wildly on the wet, greasy asphalt, the rear end fishtailing violently toward the flimsy metal guardrail that protected the edge of the ravine. I fought the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, my breath catching in my throat as the car spun 90 degrees. The headlights swept across the dark wall of the forest, illuminating the ancient trees in a chaotic, strobing flash, before the vehicle finally came to a shuddering halt. The front bumper was barely inches away from the jagged rock face. The sudden deceleration caused the engine to stall. The dashboard lights flickered twice and died, plunging the interior into a suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the rhythmic, amber flash of the hazard lights reflecting off the wet stone ahead. I sat there for several seconds, my chest heaving, my hands trembling so violently that I couldn't lift them from the steering wheel. The only sound was the frantic, mechanical clicking of the turn signal relay and the sound of my own ragged breathing. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, leaning my head back against the headrest, trying to stop the world from spinning. "Did you see that? Why didn't you tell me earlier? I could have killed us both." I turned my head to the right to look at her, expecting to see her terrified, or at least looking back at me. The passenger seat was completely empty. My breath stopped in my throat. I stared at the dark fabric of the seat. It was perfectly dry. The seatbelt was clicked into its housing against the B-pillar, exactly where it had been when I was driving alone. There had been no sound of a door opening, no metallic click of a latch, no rush of cold air from the outside. I reached over and grabbed the handle of the passenger door. It was locked from the inside, the mechanical security pin firmly depressed. A wave of primal, unadulterated panic swept over me. I unlocked the doors with a trembling hand and threw myself out into the pouring mist, stumbling onto the wet road. Her voice didn't sound like it came from a living person. It was a hollow, echoing vibration that seemed to emanate directly from the glass of the windows, rattling the dashboard. "That is the curve where I died." Before my brain could even process the horror of her words, a massive shape materialized in the middle of the lane, a collapsed boulder from the hillside, completely blocking the path. "Oh my God," I gasped, slamming my foot onto the brake pedal with everything I had. I looked around wildly, the amber flashes of my hazard lights providing brief, nightmarish glimpses of the surrounding forest. "Hello," I screamed into the dark, my voice cracking with terror. "Where did you go? Hello." The hills offered no echo. There was only the sound of the rain dripping from the eucalyptus leaves and the distant, low roar of water moving through the bottom of the ravine. I crawled back into my car, restarted the engine with a hand that didn't feel like my own, and backed away from the boulder before I found a space wide enough to turn around. I drove back to Lugo, taking the long way around via the state highway, arriving at my apartment just as the first gray light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. I didn't sleep that morning. I haven't slept well since. I quit my job at the logistics warehouse 3 weeks later, taking a massive pay cut to work a daytime retail position in the city where I never have to drive past sunset. What haunts me the most isn't the memory of her disappearance or the impossible state of that road. It's a detail I noticed a week after the incident, when I finally gathered the courage to clean out the passenger side of the car. On the interior of the passenger window, embedded deep within the grime that had accumulated on the glass, were 2 distinct handprints. They weren't facing outward, as if someone outside was trying to peer in. They were pressed hard against the glass from the inside, the long, thin fingers spread wide, right where she had been sitting, as if someone had been trying to hold on while the car skidded toward the edge. There is a reason I never returned to that house. It stands at the very end of Cal San Pedro, a narrow, cobblestone alleyway in the historic heart of Bina, a small town in the province of Cordoba. When I bought it in the spring of 2024, I viewed it as my salvation. I had just gone through a bitter, protracted divorce that had left my bank account depleted and my mental health in tatters. The noise and constant, aggressive energy of Madrid felt like an ongoing interrogation, and when I saw the listing for this traditional, 2-story white-walled house for less than 50,000 euros, I thought it was a clerical error. The real estate agent, a harried man who seemed overly eager to close the deal, told me it had belonged to an elderly widow who had passed away without any direct heirs. It had sat vacant for nearly 7 years, gathering dust and absorbing the silence of the neighborhood. When I first walked through the heavy wooden front door, the house smelled exactly as you would expect an old Andalusian property to smell. A mixture of dry lime, old mortar, stored olive oil, and that specific trapped humidity that lives within thick stone walls. The floors were made of unpolished, handmade terracotta tiles, and the interior patio was beautiful. A small square of open sky surrounded by whitewashed pillars where a single, stunted lemon tree grew in a terracotta pot. It felt peaceful. It felt like a place where a man could disappear and rebuild his life one day at a time. For the first month, my routine was entirely mundane. I spent my mornings working on freelance translation contracts at a small desk in the living room, and my afternoons stripping old layers of wallpaper, painting the bedrooms, and clearing out the accumulated junk from the previous owner. The walls were incredibly thick, nearly 3 feet of stone and mortar designed to keep the interior cool during the brutal, 40-degree summer days of southern Spain. But that thickness also had an isolating effect. Once you closed the heavy front door, the sounds of the town, the occasional moat, the voices of children playing in the next street over, were completely obliterated. You were left alone with the sound of your own breathing and the occasional creak of the old roof timbers. The first hint that something was amiss occurred in early November. I was sitting in the kitchen around 9 in the morning, drinking a cup of black coffee and reviewing a dense legal text on my laptop. The kitchen was on the ground floor, a narrow room with a low ceiling and a small window that looked out onto the interior patio. As I reached for my mug, my gaze accidentally brushed against a dark gray smudge on the whitewashed wall, located just to the left of the old refrigerator, near the baseboard. My initial reaction was entirely rational. In these old houses, rising damp is a constant structural battle. The water from the underground limestone channels seeps into the foundations and climbs up the porous plaster, leaving dark mineral stains. I got a bucket of warm water, a heavy splash of industrial bleach, and a stiff scrubbing brush. I knelt on the terracotta tiles and went to work. The stain was remarkably stubborn. It didn't smear or wash away like common black mold. It seemed as though the gray discoloration was coming from deep within the plaster itself, embedded in the very grain of the lime. After 10 minutes of hard scrubbing, the wall was wet and smelled heavily of chlorine, but the smudge remained unchanged. I sighed, figuring I would just let it dry and apply a thick coat of damp sealing primer over the weekend. The next morning, when I entered the kitchen to make breakfast, I noticed the stain had expanded. It was now roughly the size of a human head, but it hadn't just grown. The internal geometry of the smudge had shifted. I stood there with my coffee pot in hand, staring at the wall in the gray, overcast light coming from the patio. The dark gray discoloration had formed two distinct, deep circles near the top, a vertical shadow beneath them, and a long, slightly asymmetric horizontal curve at the bottom. It looked exactly like a human face. It wasn't a detailed, photographic representation, but rather a crude, primitive caricature, the kind of face a child might draw with charcoal, or the shape you might see in the rough bark of an old tree. I smiled to myself, shaking my head. I knew what it was: pareidolia. It's the well-documented psychological phenomenon where the human brain, which is hardwired to recognize facial patterns for survival, interprets random shapes as human countenances. I took out my phone and took a quick photograph of the wall to send to my sister in Barcelona, intending to make a joke about my new house having its own resident ghost. After taking the photo, I didn't wait for the weekend. I fetched a can of high-grade, oil-based blocking primer from the patio, a roller, and applied 3 thick, overlapping coats of paint directly over the stain until the wall was a uniform, blinding white. That afternoon, I opened the photo on my phone to send the text message. As I zoomed in on the image of the gray smudge to make sure it was clear, my finger froze on the screen. A cold sensation trickled down my spine. On the small digital display, the stain didn't look like a random assortment of shadows anymore. The resolution of the camera seemed to have captured micro details that my bare eyes had missed. The 2 dark circles had distinct, pale rims around them, resembling eyelids, and the vertical shadow had the clear, sharp bridge of a human nose. The mouth wasn't just a line. It was a dark, open cavity, and inside it, the pixels formed the faint, unmistakable suggestion of broken teeth. The expression was one of intense, silent agony. I didn't send the text. I deleted the photo from my gallery, wiped my hands on my jeans, and told myself that the digital sensor was simply artifacting due to the poor lighting in the kitchen. That night, around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up. The house was dead quiet, save for the distant, rhythmic ticking of the old clock in the living room. I lay perfectly still under the heavy blankets, my eyes wide, listening to a sound that didn't belong. It was a very faint, dry sound, coming from somewhere on the ground floor. It sounded like a constant scratching, the sound of someone dragging their fingernails very gently across a rough, plastered surface. It would last for 5 or 6 seconds, stop, and then repeat from a slightly different position. I convinced myself it was rats. Old houses in rural Spain are prone to field mice or rats migrating into the walls when the winter temperatures begin to drop. I resolved to buy some traps at the hardware store the next day, turned over on my side, and eventually drifted back into a fitful, dreamless sleep. When I went downstairs the next morning, the smell of bleach had entirely evaporated, replaced by the faint, metallic scent of the new paint. I walked over to the kitchen wall. The primer was completely dry, its surface smooth and white, but the face was back. It hadn't bled through the paint in the way ink or oil does. Instead, it looked as though the very pigment of the white primer had altered its chemical structure, turning a dull, matte gray to reform the exact same image. Only now it was sharper. The lines were more defined, and the hollow dark circles now had small, dark points in the center that seemed to catch the light from the window. The mouth was wider, the dark void cutting deeper into the wall. My heart began to beat with a heavy, unnatural rhythm. I walked over and pressed my palm flat against the face. The plaster was bone dry. It wasn't cold, nor was it warm. It felt entirely inert. Determined to find a logical explanation, I went outside to the alleyway to speak with my neighbor, Senora Maria, an elderly woman who spent most of her mornings sweeping the cobblestones in front of her house. I offered a polite greeting and casually brought up the condition of my house. "Senora Maria," I said, keeping my tone light, "the previous owner, the old woman who lived here, did she ever have problems with dampness in the kitchen? I'm trying to fix a persistent stain on the lower wall." The old woman stopped her broom. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly behind her thick glasses. She glanced toward my open front door and then back at me. "That house has always had issues with the stone, young man. Don't waste your money on paint. The ground beneath us is old. Sometimes what is buried down there tries to come up." "What do you mean by that?" I asked, a slight edge creeping into my voice. She shrugged her shoulders, a gesture of old, rural indifference. "Before the widow lived there during the war, that alley was used for many things. People disappeared. The house has changed hands quickly. Just leave the walls alone, son. Put a cabinet in front of it." I went back inside, her vague words doing nothing to calm the growing knot of paranoia in my gut. I didn't want to put a cabinet in front of it. I wanted it gone. I went to the tool shed in the patio, fetched a heavy club hammer and a cold chisel, and went back to the kitchen. I knelt before the wall and struck the plaster. I worked for 2 hours, my breath coming in short, angry gasps as I chipped away the white primer, the underlying plaster and the old mortar, until I had carved a raw, jagged hole in the wall about 2 inches deep, exposing the rough, gray limestone blocks of the house's core structure. I gathered the debris into a bucket, swept the floor, and left the hole open, intending to let the stone dry out completely before filling it with fresh, modern cement. That night the scraping sound returned, but it wasn't faint anymore. It woke me at exactly 3 in the morning. It was coming from directly beneath my bedroom floorboards, right above the kitchen ceiling. It sounded like someone was trapped inside the very floor structure, their fingers desperately clawing at the wood from the dark side, trying to find a seam to rip open. The vibration was so distinct that I could feel it through the frame of my bed. I sat up instantly, reaching for the switch of my bedside lamp. I clicked it. The light turned on for a fraction of a second, illuminating the room in a harsh, yellow glare, before the bulb pop flashed and died, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. In that sudden silence, the scraping stopped. The house became so quiet that I could hear the blood rushing through my own ears. I sat there, paralyzed, my hand still resting on the plastic switch of the lamp. Then, from the far corner of the bedroom, near the heavy, antique oak wardrobe that had come with the house, I heard a sound that made my chest tight until it was painful. It was a soft, wet, elongated sigh. It sounded like someone who had been holding their breath underwater for minutes finally reaching the surface. I scrambled frantically for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers slipping on the plastic casing before I managed to grip it. I turned on the screen, using the bright white light of the display to illuminate the corner of the room. The wardrobe was there, its dark wood reflecting the artificial light. There was no one in the room. I breathed out a long, trembling breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. But as I swept the beam of light across the polished wooden panels of the wardrobe doors, my eyes locked onto the natural grain of the oak. The knots and dark lines of the wood had changed. They were no longer distributed randomly across the panel. They had clustered together near the top of the left door, forming three distinct, distorted countenances. They weren't detailed drawings. They were formed entirely by the natural swirls of the dark grain, but their expressions were unmistakable. They were faces of pure, unadulterated torment, their eyes wide, their mouths stretched downward into impossibly long, silent screams. I didn't move. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone light fixed on those wooden panels until my hand began to cramp. Every time I blinked, every time my eyes drifted for a second, the expressions on those wooden faces seemed to have shifted by a millimeter. One seemed to be turning its head slightly toward the bed. Another seemed to be opening its mouth wider. As soon as the first morning light began to turn the bedroom window a pale gray, I stood up. My mind was completely spent, a chaotic mess of sleep deprivation and absolute terror. I packed a small duffel bag with my laptop, some clothes, and my passport. I couldn't stay in that house for another hour. As I carried my bag down the stairs, the air in the house felt heavy, almost viscous, as if I were moving through water. I reached the ground floor and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. I didn't want to look, but a horrific curiosity pulled my eyes toward the hole I had chiseled into the wall. The hole was there, surrounded by white dust, but the raw, gray limestone blocks inside the cavity were no longer gray. The natural dark veins and mineral deposits within the ancient rock had migrated. They had converged in the center of the opening to form a new face. This one was larger than the one before, more detailed, and infinitely more terrifying. It was the face of an old woman, her cheeks sunken, her eyes completely hollowed out, her mouth opened so wide that the dark cavity seemed to absorb the dim morning light entering the room. I dropped my house keys on the floor. They hit the terracotta tiles with a sharp, metallic ring that seemed to echo through the empty house. As I bent down with a trembling hand to retrieve them, my eyes caught my own reflection in the brushed chrome surface of the refrigerator door. My reflection was there, pale and exhausted. But in the reflection, the kitchen behind me wasn't the room I was standing in. In the reflection, the clean, white walls were entirely gone, replaced by a dark, glistening surface that looked like wet earth. And embedded in that earth were dozens of gray, distorted faces. Men, women, children. All of them packed together tightly, their hollow eyes staring directly at the back of my neck. I didn't pick up the keys. I left them on the floor, turned around, and ran out of the house, slamming the heavy wooden door behind me. I ran down Cal San Pedro without looking back, my heart hammering against my ribs until I reached the main square of the town. I never went back to that house. I checked into a modern, sterile hotel in Cordoba that afternoon, and 2 weeks later, I hired a property management firm to liquidate the house and everything inside it at a massive financial loss. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted my name off the deed. The property was purchased 3 months ago by a young expatriate couple from Germany who wanted a traditional home to renovate. Sometimes, when I'm browsing social media in my new apartment in Valencia, I see their posts. They are documentation of their progress, smiling photos of them painting the rooms, installing modern fixtures, and hosting dinners in the interior patio. They look incredibly happy. The walls in their photos are bright, clean, and covered in modern plaster. But 3 days ago, they uploaded a gallery of their new dining room. In one of the photos, the wife is smiling at the camera, holding a glass of wine. In the background, just behind her shoulder, visible in the dark reflection of the double-glazed patio door, there is a small gray smudge on the pristine white wall. It has 2 dark circles and a hollow, open mouth. They haven't commented on it. They probably think it's just a bit of dust or a shadow from the lemon tree. But I know what it is. And I know that sooner or later they will try to paint over it.
I still check my front door every night before going to bed. It is a ritual that has persisted for over 12 years, a mechanical habit that my wife attributes to mild obsessive-compulsive disorder, but it has nothing to do with psychology. It is a response to a specific memory, a memory of a sound that I heard when I was 14 years old, growing up in a small agricultural town in the vast, arid plains of Valdepeñas. In those rural parts of central Spain, the landscape dominates everything. The summer is a brutal, blinding white heat that bakes the earth until it cracks, and the winter is a lonely, freezing wind that sweeps across miles of empty vineyards and olive groves. When you are a child in those villages, you are raised on a diet of caution. Your parents don't warn you about traffic or strangers in white vans, they warn you about the land itself. They tell you never to climb over the low stone walls that mark the old property boundaries, never to peer into the uncovered stone wells that hide in the weeds, and above all, never to wander away from the paved roads during the harvest season. September was always the most chaotic month of the year. The town would flood with hundreds of seasonal laborers, migrant workers who arrived in battered old cars to harvest the grapes, working from dawn until dusk under the blazing sun before disappearing into the isolated barracks and abandoned barns scattered across the valley. It was a Friday in late September, near the end of the harvest. The air was thick and heavy with the sweet, slightly sickening scent of fermenting grape must that drifted from the local cooperatives, and the dust from the constant line of tractors hung over the fields like a permanent golden fog. I had stayed late at my friend Alejandro's house on the other side of the valley, playing video games and wasting time, completely oblivious to the hour. By the time I finally left his house to walk home, the sun had already slipped below the horizon, leaving only a thin, bloody streak of red across the dark edge of the earth. My route home was a 3-kilometer stretch of an unlit dirt agricultural road that cut directly through the center of 2 massive ancient vineyards. The vines were old, their thick, twisted wooden trunks looking like gnarled hands reaching up from the red soil, their heavy leaves creating a wall of shadow on either side of the path. The silence out there was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my own sneakers on the loose gravel and the distant, dry rattle of cicadas dying in the brush. I had covered about half the distance when I heard the sound behind me. It was an irregular, heavy sound that didn't match the rhythm of a normal stride. It was a distinct drag crunch, drag crunch, drag crunch. It sounded like someone walking with a severe limp, or someone hauling something incredibly heavy behind them on the ground. I stopped walking and turned around. The light was failing fast, turning the landscape into a uniform shade of deep violet. About 70 meters back, a figure was moving slowly along the center of the dirt road. It was a man remarkably tall and impossibly thin, his silhouette elongated against the pale horizon. He wore a long, tattered trench coat of a faded, filthy brown color, a garment that was completely absurd given the warm, lingering heat of the September evening. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his forehead, obscuring his entire upper face in absolute shadow. But it was the object over his right shoulder that made my breath hitch. He was carrying a massive, stained burlap sack. The sack was long, stretching from his shoulder all the way down past his knees, and it appeared to be filled with something heavy and uneven. Every time the man took a step with his right leg, the bottom of the dense burlap sack would drag heavily through the dirt and gravel of the road. Drag crunch. An immediate, visceral wave of unease washed over me. There was something deeply wrong with the geometry of his body. His arms were too long, his hands hanging down near his knees, and his head was tilted at an unnatural, stiff angle, as if his neck were locked in place. I turned around and began to walk faster, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. The sound behind me didn't fade, it grew louder. The intervals between the sounds grew shorter. Drag crunch, drag crunch. He was accelerating, his long, thin legs covering ground with a terrifying efficiency despite his awkward, limping gait. I broke into a jog, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The dirt road seemed to stretch out infinitely in front of me, the gnarled vines on either side looking like rows of silent spectators watching me run. I didn't look back until I finally hit the edge of the town, where the dirt path gave way to modern asphalt and the first yellow streetlights were beginning to flicker to life. I stopped beneath the safety of a light pole, my lungs burning, and turned around. The dirt road behind me was completely empty. The pale gravel path lay silent between the dark walls of the vineyards. There were no trees large enough to hide a man, no intersecting paths, no ditches deep enough to conceal someone carrying a massive sack. He had simply disappeared into the open fields. When I got home, my grandfather was sitting on the covered front porch, whittling a piece of olive wood with his old pocket knife, the shavings falling like pale snow around his boots. He was a quiet man, his face lined with 70 years of hard labor in the sun. I sat down on the stone step next to him, trying to stop my hands from shaking. "Grandfather," I said, my voice still trembling slightly, "I saw a strange man on the agricultural road just now. He was tall, wearing an old coat, and he was dragging a massive burlap sack behind him." The rhythmic sound of the pocket knife stopped instantly. My grandfather didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on the wood in his hands, his knuckles turning white around the horn handle of the knife. The silence between us grew heavy and fragile. "Did he look at you, Lucas?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that I had never heard him use before. "I don't think so," I replied, startled by his intensity. "His hat was pulled down. He was just walking. Who is he? Is he one of the new harvest workers down at the Vega farm?" My grandfather slowly folded his knife and put it into his pocket. He looked out into the dark street, his eyes reflecting the yellow glare of the streetlight. "There are men who come for the grapes, Lucas, and there are things that come because the grapes bring people. If you see him again, you do not look at his face. You do not look at the sack, and if he stops, you run as fast as your legs can carry you. You don't look back, and you don't listen to what's inside it." I tried to press him for more information, but he refused to speak another word on the matter. He stood up, brushed the wood shavings from his trousers, and went inside, locking the heavy wooden door behind him. I thought he was just playing into the old local folklore, the stories that old people tell to keep teenagers from wandering the dark roads at night and getting into trouble. But 5 days later, I saw him again, and this time it wasn't in the isolated fields. It was a Tuesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock. The sun was directly overhead, beating down on the town square with a blinding white intensity. The square was full of life. Old men were sitting on the stone benches under the shade of the orange trees. Women were carrying plastic bags full of vegetables from the market, and a few children were kicking a football against the wall of the old church. I was sitting at an outdoor table of a small cafe, drinking a soda while waiting for my mother to finish an appointment at the bank across the street. I happened to look over toward the old stone fountain in the center of the plaza, and my entire body went numb. He was standing there, leaning against the carved stone basin. Despite the oppressive 30-degree heat, he was still wearing the same heavy, filthy brown trench coat and the wide-brimmed hat. The massive burlap sack was resting on the cobblestones beside his long, dirt-encrusted boots. The sack looked different now. It was lumpy, full of irregular protrusions, and the bottom third of the rough fabric was soaked through with a dark, damp stain that looked like dried purple grape juice, or old blood. The truly terrifying aspect of the scene wasn't just his presence. It was the total indifference of the people around him. An elderly man walked right past him, his shoulder passing within inches of the tattered sleeve of the trench coat without even turning his head. 2 children ran past the fountain, their ball bouncing off the stone just a foot from the wet burlap sack, completely oblivious to the towering figure standing over them. He was entirely invisible to the rest of the world. As I stared, horrified, my fingers frozen around my soda glass, the man slowly, deliberately lifted his head. Beneath the shadow of the wide brim, there were no human features. There were no eyes, no nose, no eyebrows, just a flat, smooth expanse of pale, leathery skin that looked like old parchment. But across the lower half of that blank face, a wide, lipless mouth slowly split open, stretching from one side of his jaw to the other, revealing rows of small, pointed yellow teeth in a sickening, unnatural grin. He reached down with an impossibly long, skeletal hand, gripped the tied neck of the burlap sack, and began to drag it across the cobblestones, walking directly toward my table. The sound returned, but it was amplified 100 times over. The drag crunch of the rough burlap against the historic cobblestones of the plaza was deafening. It didn't sound like a normal object. It sounded like a heavy weight grinding over broken bone. The noise filled my head, drowning out the ambient sounds of the square, the chatter of the cafe patrons, the engines of the cars, the bells of the church. Everything became completely silent, replaced entirely by that rhythmic, mechanical scraping. Panic, primal and absolute, seized my limbs. I stood up so violently that my metal chair tipped over backward, crashing against the tiled floor of the terrace. The noise broke the spell. I turned and ran inside the cafe, hiding behind the heavy wooden bar counter, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. The barista looked at me with an expression of profound confusion, asking me what was wrong. When I finally gathered the courage to peer over the edge of the counter and look through the glass window a minute later, the fountain was empty. The man, the sack, the sound, all were gone. The final encounter occurred 2 weeks later, during the first week of October, and it is the reason I can never set foot in that province again. It was a Saturday night, and my parents had driven to a neighboring village to attend a wedding anniversary dinner, leaving me alone in our house. Our home was an old, single-story stone structure located on the absolute periphery of the town, its backyard facing the endless expanse of the olive groves. Around 11 o'clock, a massive autumn thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. The wind was ferocious, howling through the narrow alleys and rattling the heavy wooden shutters until they shook in their frames. The rain was hitting the corrugated tin roof of the tool shed like a volley of small stones, creating a chaotic, deafening wall of noise. I was sitting in the living room with all the lights on, trying to concentrate on a television show to drown out the storm, when the television screen suddenly flickered, the picture dissolving into a grid of green lines. A second later, the lights in the house went out, plunging the interior into pitch blackness. In the sudden silence that followed the loss of power during a brief lull in the thunder, I heard it. Drag, crunch, crunch. The sound was coming from the gravel pathway inside our front gate, right below the living room window. My entire body went rigid, my muscles locking up with an intensity that was physically painful. I crept out of the living room, my back pressed hard against the cold, plastered wall of the hallway, moving toward the heavy oak front door. The sound continued, steady, deliberate, unhurried, drag, crunch. It reached the bottom of the 2 concrete steps that led to the front porch. Then it stopped. Through the thick wood of the door, I heard a heavy, wet, solid thud. It sounded like a large, soft sack filled with wet earth being dropped onto the concrete floor of the porch. For a minute, there was nothing but the sound of the wind screaming through the eaves of the roof. Then a new sound began, a sound that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It was a voice, but it wasn't the voice of the man. It was coming from inside the sack, right on the other side of the threshold. It was the muffled, trembling voice of a young boy, crying out in a desperate, suffocating whisper. "Please, help me, it's so dark in here, I can't breathe, it smells like old iron, please let me out." My blood ran cold. The voice belonged to Diego. Diego was a 12-year-old boy from our street, the son of the local baker, who had gone missing 3 days prior after failing to return from his afternoon football practice. The entire town had been out searching the hills, checking the irrigation ditches and the abandoned buildings, but they had found nothing. A powerful, overwhelming human instinct took control of me. Every moral fiber in my body told me to unlock the door, to grab a knife, to help the child who was suffocating on my front porch. I stepped forward, my hand extending into the dark, my fingers wrapping around the cold, brass handle of the deadbolt. But as my fingers began to turn the metal, my grandfather's words echoed in my mind with the force of a physical blow. "Do not let him get close enough to hear what's inside. If he stops, you don't look back and you don't listen." I stopped. I withdrew my hand as if the brass had burned me. Moving with agonizing slowness, I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the small, glass peephole in the center of the door. A massive flash of lightning illuminated the front yard, turning the night into a bright, monochromatic white for a single second. The man in the trench coat was standing right there. His face was inches from the glass of the peephole. He had no eyes, no sockets, just that smooth, white skin, but he knew exactly where I was. He was holding the tied neck of the massive burlap sack open with both of his long, skeletal hands, stretching the dark opening wide. His terrifying, lipless mouth was open in that impossible, yellow grin, waiting for the door to click open. Inside the dark opening of the sack, illuminated by the fading glare of the lightning, I could see something moving, something twisting and turning in the dark, frantic and trapped, its small hands pressing against the coarse brown fabric from the inside. I stepped back from the door, my breath catching in my throat, and covered my ears with my hands to block out the muffled crying that was beginning to rise again from the porch. I ran to the very back of the house, locked myself in the small, windowless bathroom, and sat on the tiled floor with my knees pulled against my chest, waiting for the dawn. When the police found Diego's body 2 weeks later, it wasn't in a ditch or a well. A group of hunters found him inside an abandoned stone tool shed in the middle of a remote olive grove, nearly 12 kilometers from the town. The official medical report stated that he had died of asphyxiation, likely due to being confined in a small space. The detail that the police withheld from the media, but that my father accidentally mentioned to my mother while they were whispering in the kitchen late one night, was that when they found the boy, his clothes and his hair were completely covered in thick, coarse fibers of old burlap, and his mouth and eyes had been sewn shut with rough, heavy twine. I live in a modern high-rise apartment in Madrid now on the 11th floor. The building has electronic keycards, security cameras in the lobby, and concrete walls that isolate me from the street below. There are no fields here, no harvests, no dirt roads. But every autumn when the storm winds blow from the mountains and the rain hits the glass of my living room window, I cannot sleep. I lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. Because sometimes, beneath the distant roar of the city traffic and the sound of the rain, I can hear a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the carpeted hallway outside my apartment door. Drag, crunch, and then a soft, muffled scratching at the bottom of the wood, accompanied by a small, child's voice whispering through the gap under the door, begging me to open it because the sack is too tight.